Good afternoon. And welcome to this historic hall where so many advances in science and medicine have been explained, have been developed and explained to the community. And for many generations, that's been happening in this hall. So we're so pleased to be here and very grateful to Dr. Nipam Patel for his hospitality and that of Kerry Mills and Diana Kenny and Kim and Mike for enabling this occasion to take place. We're here for the discussion of affordable workforce housing, attainable housing. I want to thank Robert Mascali, Falmouth Selectman, Laura Moynihan, Executive Director of the Falmouth Housing Trust, and Mark Forrest, Barnstable County Commissioner and Yarmouth Selectman, for coming today. This event is co-sponsored by the Jewel Cobb Action Coalition and the Housing Assistance Corporation. And I always have to thank Helen Molina, who first suggested that our organizations work together. We also thank Racial Justice Falmouth for their stalwart support for every endeavor. I'm Ruth Strauss-Gaynor, here with Sandra Gifford. Thank you. And that's Sandra Gifford. We are co-chairs of, yay. We're co-chairs of Jewel Cobb Coalition, or the JCAC. I hope you noticed the photos of Dr. Cobb in the lobby. Jewel Plummer Cobb was a distinguished scientist and educator who came to MBL as a graduate student in 1949 and kept returning throughout her long and prolific career, and has a house that, or had a house here that her family still owns and uses. In addition to her work as a cell biologist, cancer researcher, professor, dean, and university president of Cal State at Fullerton, Dr. Cobb always worked for inclusive, welcoming environments. Her life inspired the start of the Jewel Cobb Action Coalition. And Michael Goldring, who called her work to us, and was the first one who said we should be named for her, is here today also. So thank you so much, Michael. His mother, Irene Goldring, was a colleague of Jewel Plummer Cobb and a graduate student with her. This year, the JCAC received a Civic Engagement Award from No Place for Hate. We share that award with each of you today because by coming to this event, you show your engagement with the critical issue of housing our community. Thank you for showing up. When we began studying housing needs, the first thing we learned was it's complicated is not an answer for anything. Probing more deeply, we learned that the housing crisis is really crises. A crisis of policy, a crisis of money, a crisis of design, and a crisis of ethics. We learned that the income level gap between those who can buy houses here and those who need houses to work here is totally out of whack and keeps widening insidiously. When excluded, how Snob Zoning NIMBYism, and class bias, build the walls we cannot see, first came out, we thought that Rick Kahlenberg had written it just for us. Snob zoning, that's restricting acre-sized lots to only one family dwelling per lot. In some places, it's 2-acre lots per single family. It's also when an area is divided up into new zip codes, each one having a different status level or a fancy name. That's another type of snob zoning. NIMBYism, we're all for it, but don't even think about bringing it to our exclusive neighborhood. Class bias, that's saying you're bringing in riffraff. And we heard that shouted after a young scientist expressed her need for an affordable rental so she would be able to work and plan a future here. We've heard it all, with every proposal suggested right here in Falmouth. Housing Assistance helped us organize today's program about this disastrous situation. Alisa Magnotta is Chief Executive Officer of Housing Assistance, the regional housing agency for Cape Cod and the islands. During her 7-year tenure, she has transformed Housing Assistance by nearly doubling its size, diversifying its revenue stream, and creating innovative programs to address the housing needs of low and middle-income people across the region. The agency served more than 6,500 people in 2023, with services and programs ranging from homeless outreach and prevention, housing stabilization, and education and advocacy to address a protracted regional housing crisis. It is my honor now to welcome Alisa here today.
Thank you. Can you all hear me by standing here? Great. So that's such a perfect introduction and really speaks to a lot of what we're seeing and experiencing in the community right now. You may have been reading about our project in Dennis on Love Lane, a homeless shelter that we want to put in an old nursing home. And it is very interesting to me to be on this side of the equation advocating for homeless and the most fragile amongst us. Not surprising that we're getting opposition, but it does remind me that every time affordable housing has an address, all of a sudden people don't want it. People are for affordable housing, right, until it has an address. And in a homeless shelter, it's even worse if you can think of that. And when we think about housing, it is complex, right? And we know that. And we know that it takes smart people to kind of work through the details. But we also know that it takes courage. It takes a lot of courage for these people who sit on planning boards, sit on select boards, sit on their affordable housing trusts to stand up to their friends and neighbors for doing the right thing for the rest of us. And so courage is something that in some cases we're short on in the region, and people become afraid in a group setting to speak up. And so a lot of times we do look for groups like this to be able to put panels together, put audience members together so that together we can feel that we have that kinship and that camaraderie. Because we know that there are more of us that want housing and that want a good outcome for our youth and for our economy and for our community. But the people that are often sitting on the dais or who are on the committees, they're really entrenched in keeping things the same. And so finding that courage within ourselves to speak up to the opposition is a big piece of our mission, empowering and educating people. The other thing that's really important in housing, the other two C words that I'm gonna use, cash, right? Housing is expensive. It is expensive to build, it's expensive to maintain, it's expensive to rent, it's expensive to buy. And so sometimes the sticker shock can come to, can change the dialogue in a community where all of a sudden they start backing off on housing. Can't we do it cheaper? Can't we do it another way? Does it have to be that big, right? So that's another place for us to have courage to put action behind our values. And if we do truly value having an inclusive region and a region that is a thriving, a place where people can thrive and families can live and we can raise our families so that we're here for generations, then we really have to figure out a way to put our money behind our values and our policies. And the third component is community, and that comes down to regulations. And less than 5% of the land in our region is zoned for multifamily housing. Less than 5%. The rest is commercial or single family, right? So doing apartments, where you can have one foundation, you know, the infrastructure is cheaper, is just not feasible or possible without some really strong support from towns, funding from towns, and really courageous citizens who will stand up to the people sitting on the dais who are trying to organize and spend money and time to stop us and to stop progress for our region. So when I read the book, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a case study for Cape Cod. Like, I don't think Richard realized, like, this could have been written about Cape Cod on so many levels. So I'm very thrilled that our speaker is here to really help us understand and put into context on a bigger picture level of what could be, what possibilities there are. You know, if we take the time to learn from history and then take a page out of what's working, what levers we can push and pull in order to get an outcome that's really good for all of us, right? It doesn't take away from any of us to have my neighbor have a safe, affordable place to live. I'm still gonna have my house. Like, it's not pie, there's only so much, right? There's enough housing and enough land to be able to build housing that will be, you know, honor our environment and our land that we have to preserve and that we have to protect, right? That's a very real concept here on Cape Cod, that we have to be very, very careful about our environment and open space. But when some towns have 80% of their town in open space, right, we know that we can have some places where you can allow by right apartments, condos, smaller homes that are much more affordable. And we're never about build, baby, build, you know, just build anywhere. It's always around infrastructure. It's always around village center and being smart about it. But taking lessons from and getting facts from experts and getting momentum from state initiatives and federal initiatives is really how we're going to be able to change things. We started Housing to Protect Cape Cod 5 years ago, and it's a one town at a time, empowering and engaging citizens to be able to learn about housing and then speak up for housing. And we just know that there's no possible way that we're going to get the scale of housing that we need doing it one town at a time. And that's why legislation like 40B legislation, if you're familiar with that, that legislation has really been the most impactful to housing production in our state, and often the envy of other developers and states and developers in other states, because it allows a developer or a builder like us, to build an apartment complex on land that's not zoned for an apartment complex if the town hasn't met their 10% affordability marker. So it's a really important tool for us to support and advocate for, but it takes that kind of big brother approach, that big, the governor calls it Bigfoot approach, to making sure that we have the right legislation and the right regulations in order to be able to build housing, because so many people will stop it along the way. And the governor's most recent Affordable Housing Act, right? In there she made ADUs by right, which is really big for us. I don't know if you remember, but we've been advocating for accessory dwelling units for 5-7 years, for towns to change their bylaws so that a homeowner could put on a small apartment so that we can age in place or bring our family back. And so many towns put so many restrictions on it, or just outright denied the ability for even to get to town floor, that we've seen, some success, but not enough success to be able to get the volume and the construction numbers, the number of units online that we had hoped for. So in the Affordable Housing Act, she made ADUs by right. So it takes that kind of Bigfoot approach sometimes to change the course and change the trajectory. And I think that that's where I'm interested in hearing more from our speaker about that kind of big picture thinking, that those levers that then impact the smaller town or impact all of us as we think about our communities and what kind of community we want to build. I had these remarks planned and I have said nothing from them, so I'm just gonna, but it's, we are at a very pivotal point in our region where we do need people to get on boards and to have a seat at the table and to really do more than just be an advocate at the microphone. We really need people who have the time and are willing to roll up their sleeves and get involved. Because if we don't change this trajectory and start adding the right kind of housing, meaning the right size, the right price, right, for year-round housing, right? That's what we need. We need year-round housing. If we don't have people really advocating for that and making that happen, our little Cape Cod isn't going to be ours anymore. It's really going to be converted over to second homeowners and a tourist destination. And we don't have to look far. We can look at Nantucket, we can look at Martha's Vineyard, you can look at P-Town. I live in Orleans. My town has changed dramatically in the 20 years that I've lived there because of the skyrocketing real estate prices and the allowance of Airbnbs. And when you can treat a house like a hotel, right, you just completely change the dynamics of a neighborhood. And so this is our time. I mean, there is no other time. This is our time. So, with that, trying to take the tools from the Affordable Housing Act, the tools that our speaker brings to us, and think about how it parlays over into our little towns and what we can do is really very, very important. I can't stress that enough. So with that, I am going to introduce our speaker. The last thing I wanted to say, here's one other little factoid for you, is that right now the median home price in the county of Barnstable is around $800,000. So that means that a household, in order to qualify for the loan, needs to be making over $200,000 a year. And just to put that in perspective, a beginning teacher makes $60,000 a year. A CNA might make $45,000 or $50,000 a year, right? So it's not a place that you're going to attract. We're not a place where we can attract families to come and raise their families here anymore, and or a place where firefighters or teachers, where they can look out and see a future for themselves, a place where they can raise their family, buy a home, really invest in the community. And if you don't have that, if you don't have people wanting to come here and wanting to make those investments, then pretty soon you're tipping the scale to be a place that's really more like a museum that people go to visit and awe over the beauty, but not really the working villages and the communities that I raised my children in, and I know many of you here raised your children in, and we're very fortunate to have the opportunity to do that. But if we want our children to raise their children here, then we have to do something about it now. And so our speaker obviously wrote this fabulous book. If you have not read it or don't have it, I highly suggest you do, because it really defines the problem, lays out examples of it, and really talks about some solutions and some ways of looking at it that I think are advantageous for our region. And he graduated from Harvard College, Harvard Law. He's a senior fellow at Progressive Policy Institute and a non-resident scholar at Georgetown McCourt School of Public Policy. Obviously very smart, and someone that we can heed the words from and the advice from. So please welcome Richard Kahlenberg, please.
Great. Thank you, Alisa, for that very kind introduction and for setting the stage for this discussion. And thank you for all the great work that the Housing Assistance Center is doing as well. And I also want to thank Ruth for reaching out to me several months ago now, I think, and staying on top of me and getting me here. And Ruth, for those of you who don't know, has been fighting for social justice for a number of years. We had some time to visit, and I was able to go with Ruth and her family around the Woods Hole area a little bit. And this is an idyllic community, one that treasures discovery and learning and curiosity. And I'm I guess the message I want to send tonight is it possible to welcome more people to this special community that you've created here? Let's see. I want to pick up on one other thing that Ruth mentioned that I thought was really powerful. This question of zoning is in many ways a question of ethics. A couple of years ago, I testified before Congress, and Emanuel Cleaver, who's a Democratic congressman from Missouri, said that when he used to sit on the zoning board in Kansas City, he said there was no venue in which you learn more about human nature. You see the best and the worst in people when these zoning decisions are made. And it is ultimately a question of what kind of society we want to have. So, final thing I will say before I begin is that I'm thrilled by this venue in particular. And let me explain why. The worst thing for a speaker, is particularly someone talking about a topic like zoning, is for someone to fall asleep in the front row, usually starts snoring quite loudly. And so I just love the fact that this this Puritan New England environment sits you in these very uncomfortable seats that will keep all of you awake, I hope. Okay. So I am going to talk about zoning and land use, and actually I went back and forth with my publisher about whether to put zoning in the title, because I said, well, that is what the book is about, but there is a sense that this is technical and it's complicated, but zoning is essentially about deciding who gets to live where in America, and that's enormously important. The biggest challenges are twofold. Right now in the United States, housing is not affordable enough, and it's too segregated. And both have to do with the way that we have set up our zoning and land use policies. It does not have to be that way. There are other parts of the world where housing is more affordable and less segregated. In Japan and Germany and France, that's the case. And the differences in land use policies and zoning has a lot to do with different levels of affordability and different levels of segregation by race and by class. So let's think a little bit about the history of zoning in the United States. It started off with the very sensible notion that we should separate industrial use from residential use because we want to promote health and safety. No one wants to live next to a toxic factory. But quickly that issue of human nature intruded, and in 1910, Baltimore enacted a racial zoning law. So this forbade black people from moving into predominantly white communities. And there were a couple of rationales that you can see the pleasant picture of Mayor Barry Mahul advanced for the idea that there should be racial zoning in Baltimore. He connected the idea to the rationale for separating industrial and residential use. He said this was about health and safety. And he said, for one thing, it was important to quarantine, and that was the word he used, black people, to prevent the spread of communicable diseases. So sit with that for a minute. That was the rationale. And then the other rationale was to protect the property values of the white majority. And if contagious diseases as a rationale for zoning has less resonance with the modern ear, the protecting of property values certainly resonates very loudly today. So the Supreme Court in 1917 struck down racial zoning laws. It said that that was a violation of the Constitution. But quickly, communities shifted, and they shifted to economic zoning. Now, in my book, Excluded, I tell the stories of a lot of individual, low-wage, single mothers who just want better opportunities for their kids and more affordable housing. And one of the families one of the people I interviewed was Chiara Cornelius. And for many, many years in the United States, Chiara would have been, because she's black, would have been excluded solely because of her race, either through racial zoning laws or through racial discrimination in the housing market, racial discrimination through the way we subsidize mortgages, through redlining, and race really was at the center of the story. But once the racial zoning laws were struck down, and once the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, things started to shift. And there were new ways created to exclude black people and people of modest means more generally from neighborhoods. And this is where we get into the issue of snob zoning. And Alisa and Ruth mentioned some of the techniques that are used. There are bans on multifamily housing, minimum lot size requirements, bans on manufactured housing, which is a lot less expensive to build than on-site housing. Sometimes a community will allow multifamily housing, but then place additional requirements. They may say, well, you can have multifamily housing, but it has to have this expensive brick facade, which has the effect of excluding as well. So there have been two big waves of exclusionary zoning in the United States. The first came after that Buchanan decision, when racial zoning was struck down, and communities quickly saw a workaround. Don't exclude by race explicitly, but exclude by class, which will serve the purpose of excluding many, and back then most, black people. And the second big wave came in the 1970s after the Fair Housing Act was passed. So these laws are pervasive. The New York Times did an analysis which found that 75% of the land in most urban areas, most metropolitan areas, most urban regions are zoned for single-family homes only. And researchers at Princeton have found that this is the primary way in which we segregate communities today by race and class, as opposed to more explicit measures. So the good news in America is that in the past 40, 50 years, we have seen some modest decline in racial segregation. So this is the Black-White Dissimilarity Index from 1940 to 2020. And you can think of 100 as being complete apartheid and 0 as being complete integration. And you can see that after the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, we have seen some modest progress. So we went from 79 to 55 in terms of black-white, the Black-White Dissimilarity Index. And that suggests about a 30% decline in racial segregation. Now, 55 is still a high number, to be sure, but we're headed in the right direction. At the same time, economic segregation has gotten worse. So researchers at Stanford estimate that basically we've seen a doubling of economic segregation since about 1970. And so this means that where you used to have more mixed income communities, the rich are pulling away in one direction and the poor are pulling away in another direction. Okay, now as a left of center person myself, one of the most disturbing things I found in the research is that the worst forms of exclusionary zoning are not in the areas where there's strong support for building a wall to Mexico, where you might think that exclusionary tendencies are the strongest. In fact, they're worse in politically liberal areas. Jenny Schutz at Brookings found that overly restrictive zoning is most prevalent and problematic in areas of the country that lean heavily Democratic in national, state, and local elections. And then within the state of California, there was one study that found that the more politically liberal areas tended to have the worst forms of exclusionary zoning compared to the less liberal areas within that state. Now, the benign explanation for this is that liberals care about the environment, and liberals care about small d democracy. And I know you have we were talking earlier about the town governance, am I getting the term right? Town meetings that you have here. And so that comes from a good impulse that you want to have people have say in how things are run. And at the same time, these mechanisms have been weaponized in recent years to stop more different types of housing from being built. The less benign explanation is that liberalism has, that we liberals have something of some biases ourselves. So Fareed Zakaria has written that if the cardinal sin of the right is racism, the cardinal sin of the left is elitism. And there's actually some social science research to back this up. There are researchers who found that with higher levels of education, you tend to see a reduction in racial prejudice as one would expect and hope. At the same time, you see an increase in prejudice against those with less education, which translates into those of lesser means. So I guess the point of outlining this finding is in part that those of us who would be horrified, properly horrified by racism, may need to look closely to see whether there's something else going on in some of the zoning decisions. Now, I've gotten this far in the talk about zoning, and we haven't gotten directly to affordability. But that is obviously the key driver of concerns about zoning laws today. There is there are ways in which zoning laws artificially limit the number and types of houses that can be built, and thereby artificially drive up housing prices. And we all know that during the pandemic, when there was not enough cars were being built, the price of used cars skyrocketed. It's a basic issue of supply and demand. I'm astounded that in the area of housing, you'll see people make convoluted arguments that somehow that basic law doesn't apply in the housing arena, but it surely does. And we know from research at Pew that in general, across the United States, over the last several years, very few new units have been built. So we've only seen a 3% increase in homes 2017 to 2021, and rents have skyrocketed, up by 31%. In some of the more hopeful communities, which I'll talk about in a minute, places like Minneapolis, New Rochelle, Portland, and Tysons, Virginia, they've made reforms, allowed for more housing, and you see modest increases in rents. In fact, Bloomberg recently had a headline that said Minneapolis, which did adopt a number of housing reforms, is the first American city to have tamed inflation, and housing was a big piece of that. So this impacts everyone. It impacts, there's a direct correlation between the issues of affordability and homelessness. Working people are particularly impacted by increasing housing prices because they have to choose between medicine for their kids and making rent. But even highly educated young people who have done everything society has asked of them, in fact, are facing these issues. Employers in a lot of communities, and I understand and here the Chamber has recognized that this is unsustainable. If we continue to have exclusionary zoning laws that drive up housing prices, it will become over time impossible to attract employees. So it used to be that in the United States, people moved to opportunity. People would move, we think of the great migration of Black people in the 20th century, fleeing Jim Crow, but also going to the north for better economic opportunities. We think of poor whites, the Okies from moving to California to improve their lot. That was the American way. You moved to where there are higher wages. That's not happening anymore. People are moving out of California, even though wages are, in some sectors, 4 times as high as in Florida, because Florida is more affordable than California. So this has a huge impact on the economy as well. For those of you who are concerned about climate change, housing is a huge issue as well. It's my understanding that many employees who work in this area have to drive across the bridge in order to get housing that's going to be affordable to them. Those commutes, all that extra driving is terrible for climate change, and it's unnecessary. If there were enough housing here, people wouldn't have to make those longer commutes. It also reduces opportunity, and this is kind of how I got into the issue. I've written about education for years, and Raj Chetty at Harvard has found that low-income children who have a chance to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods, more affluent neighborhoods, have better returns on, they're more likely to make higher wages, more likely to go to college, less likely to form single-parent homes as adults. In terms of education, low-income students do much better on average in economically mixed or more affluent schools. So these are the test scores on something known as the National Assessment for Educational Progress, NAEP. It's the gold standard for testing. Everyone thinks this is the best measure of academic learning. This is a chart that shows the academic achievement of students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. That is, they're in the lower socioeconomic half of the population. And they are, as we go from left to right, we're going from more affluent schools to higher poverty schools over here. And so low-income students who have a chance to attend more affluent or economically mixed schools are scoring 10 to 20 points higher on the NAEP in the 4th grade math, and that is the equivalent of 1 to 2 years of learning. So we're excluding people from opportunity when zoning laws essentially forbid low-income and working-class families from living in neighborhoods that have strong schools. I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, outside of DC, and there's a fascinating study that looked at 2 strategies for improving academic achievement in Montgomery County. Montgomery County is a liberal area. They try to do right by low-income students. One is to spend $2,000 extra per pupil in the higher poverty schools, the schools that have concentrations of low-income students. The other was a housing strategy. And many of you are familiar with the concept of inclusionary zoning, the opposite of exclusionary zoning, where when a builder develops a certain number of units, she sets aside a percentage of those units for low-income families. And the question in Montgomery County was, well, which system worked better? Was it better to spend $2,000 extra per pupil in the higher poverty areas, or was it better to give some low-income students a chance to live in economically mixed and some more affluent schools as well? And a researcher at Rand found that those students in the green zone, these are the more more affluent areas, the students who were in low-income housing in more privileged areas did far better over time, even though they were getting less money per pupil than those who were in the red zone. So it's a good investment as well. So for decades, the NIMBY forces almost always won, and they're still powerful today. But if you go back to the 1960s, under Richard Nixon, George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, tried to do some good things on housing. He was stopped. Barbara Mikulski, my senator from Maryland, who is was a champion of so many good issues, she was wrong on the housing issue and she killed the program that Raj Chetty studied, which allowed some low-income students to go live in, or families to live in more affluent areas. In New York State, there was an effort by Governor Hochul to try to reform housing. That was killed in 2023. And the big problem is, it's political science 101, who shows up at the meetings. And there was a powerful study done by researchers in Massachusetts, which found that the people most likely to show up at the zoning meetings were people like me. They were older, white, highly educated homeowners. Unlike me, they were also opposed to more housing. So that's a major problem. The good news is we've got lots of examples of reform. When I started researching Excluded in 2017, there weren't a whole lot of examples, but now we have many examples of victories. It started in Minneapolis in 2018, where they said this was a community where about 70% of the land was set aside for single-family residences only, and they legalized duplexes and triplexes throughout the entire city. You can build a duplex or triplex anywhere. That was followed by Oregon, Portland, Charlotte. They really made a racial justice argument in Charlotte, and they prevailed. California, Montgomery County, Maryland, Montana. There are red states that have made reforms as well. Vermont, Washington, and as Lisa mentioned, the latest victory is the Massachusetts Affordable Homes Act, which allows for accessory dwelling units. I think it's important to study what went right in these communities. In Minneapolis, they had a wonderful coalition that came together of labor unions and young people, civil rights groups, seniors, environmentalists. So the labor unions had employees in SEIU, the Service Employees Union. Their employees who worked in Minneapolis at the hospital had to take 2 buses to get to work because there was no affordable housing in Minneapolis. So this was a really important issue for labor. Young people are priced out. Civil rights groups knew that exclusionary zoning initially was aimed at racial exclusion. There's seniors who want to age in place. There are some people, we've heard of NIMBYs, there's YIMBYs, which is yes in my backyard. Now there's another group, PIMBYs, parents in my backyard. So people who want to be near their grandkids and want an accessory dwelling unit. So the secret sauce there was they really got new people involved in the process. It wasn't just the usual suspects who would show up at land use decision meetings. In Oregon, they had the Minneapolis Coalition. Rob, you'll be glad to know the home builders were a big part of this, the realtors, and rural populations. There was bipartisan support, which I'll talk about in a second. In California, it was really the high-tech employers who couldn't attract talent because housing prices were so unaffordable. I want to emphasize here that this can be a bipartisan issue. So in Oregon, you would not have had success in their effort to legalize duplexes and triplexes throughout the state if you hadn't had some Republican support. And it's fascinating. I wrote my thesis in college about Bobby Kennedy, Sr. And he brought together working class people of all different races. And that's what they did in Oregon. There were working class white people whose legislators were Republican, who kind of, maybe not for the best reason, but they wanted to stick it to the limousine liberals in the city who said they were for the environment, but in fact were engaging in exclusionary zoning. So you saw this coalition that came together. You can appeal to liberty, you can appeal to equality. In Montana, the governor talked about property, there's a property rights issue. I should be able to do with my land what I want. So there's that freedom impulse. There's an egalitarian impulse that cuts across party lines because Democrats understand the way in which people of color feel looked down upon by whites, and they try to respond to that. And some Republicans are now recognizing the way working class white people can also feel looked down upon by elites. And that can be part of what drives this. Yuval Levin has made the point that exclusionary zoning is one of these rare issues where people can come from entirely different points of view and come to the same policy conclusion nevertheless, because exclusionary zoning does offend both equality and liberty interests. Caveat, there's resistance within both political parties. So Donald Trump, in the last election, was tweeting about, in defense of exclusionary zoning, saying that the Democrats were trying to abolish the suburbs. So he was appealing to suburban housewives of America to resist what he called an invasion of people who maybe have more modest means or of different races. And I had a piece in The Atlantic a few years ago about Scarsdale. Scarsdale, New York, 70% of the votes went to Biden, but they have erected walls that essentially exclude anyone who cannot afford a single family home. I'm going to close here with an idea at the national level, but it could be enacted in the state of Massachusetts as well, of an economic Fair Housing Act. So we all know the Fair Housing Act of 1968 said it's illegal to discriminate based on race. But could we have an analogous law that said, not that the market can't discriminate based on income, because that's what markets do, but that government cannot, through its zoning laws, discriminate based on income. And so the idea would be that if a community has, say, a ban on multifamily housing that clearly discriminates against working class people, they would have to, in court, justify why that policy is necessary. And come up with, the burden would shift to them to show that there was a valid purpose. Emmanuel Cleaver, who I mentioned earlier, has been spoken in support of this idea of an economic fair housing act. And he said, I think one of the greatest tributes that we can make to Dr. King's legacy is for us this year to pass an economic fair housing act. And there he was talking about King's concern about racial justice and how it united with his concern about economic justice, an issue he talked about a lot towards the end of his life. So thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with the panel.
Thanks everyone for staying around for the panel discussion. My name is Rob Brennan, and it's my privilege to moderate this discussion today. As an attorney, working here on the front lines for an amazing client with amazing leadership that is advancing this mission of making housing stable and attainable across an entire spectrum here on Cape Cod, that has some unique challenges and pressures and dynamics that have been alluded to. And I put up on the screen, I was thinking, how do we kind of give reference to some of what we're up against? And this is a bumper sticker that is pretty easy to find on cars in Barnstable. And it kind of conveys the sentiment of some of the headwinds that housing runs into. And as you can see, it's something pretty stark, something Richard's book alludes to, but this is with kind of its own Cape Cod take on it, and it's that we're full. And just pull up the bridges. We've got everything we need, and there's not room for any more housing. So my perspective is of one that has the privilege of working with the folks that are fighting here on the front line. And we've assembled an amazing panel as well that I'm going to ask to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about their perspective on this housing crisis. And then we'll get into a discussion with Richard with some questions that the panelists have come up with. We'll have some discussion up here on the dais, and then we'll be opening it up to your questions and your observations about the hurdles to housing production and housing affordability and attainability here on Cape Cod. So we want to hear from you. The first person I'll ask to introduce herself is Hannah Vanderscheuren. I get it? Thank closely. Thank you. Hannah is relatively new here to the Cape. But came here as a research assistant at the MBL, and I think her, as someone new to the Cape, a very unique perspective. So, Hannah, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your views and perspective on the housing crisis here on the Cape.
Yeah, welcome everybody, and thank you so much, Richard, for a really wonderful talk. I moved here about 2 years ago, and mostly for the science, but I've been really welcomed by this wonderful community in Falmouth, and alongside that, realized how much of a barrier housing was to folks like me who were moving to this area. And that kind of motivated a group of us to start an organization called the Housing Action Committee at MBL to come up with some stopgap solutions for people who might be pushed out of their home due to unaffordability, unsafe situations, or part of the seasonal rental paradox here. And yeah, that's kind of the story.
So our next panelist, Ellie Costa, to tell you a little bit about herself. Ellie is rooted here. I'm going to switch mics.
Waiting for the green light here.
Yeah. So Ellie is here in Falmouth, and I think as you'll hear from Ellie, she really bridges Falmouth's history and its traditions along with some of the challenges that are being faced on the front line. So Ellie.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you so much, Richard, for your book. I gained a lot of perspective reading it, and really appreciate your work. So I have the honor to be serving as president of the Board of Farming Falmouth. I feel like I need to tell a little bit about us so that we understand this concept of bridging this intersection, actually, of basic needs. So Farming Falmouth is a nonprofit on a mission to build a stronger food system for us here on the Cape, and specifically now we're working very locally, a stronger food system for us here in Falmouth. We believe that we've outsourced far too much of our food. It's causing a lot of problems for the environment, for health, and that's actually another moment. I can tell you a lot more about Farming Falmouth another time. Our projects include educational workshops, because we want to see a lot more food growing in Falmouth, whether it's in backyards, churchyards, schoolyards. And we know that there are a lot of small parcels still in town on which a lot of good food could be grown, good, healthy, local food grown in regenerative ways. The deal is, we're working on the purchase of our first parcel right now, but our vision is to have many parcels down the road. And we see that we're up against housing, because if you don't have houses for the farmers, you don't have food, right? So food and housing it's a basic intersection of needs. I personally know a farmer here in town who was forced to move 5 times within 3 years because the living situations weren't stable. They looked good, but landlords changed their mind about what they wanted to do with the property, that sort of thing. That's just one situation. I know of 2 other young farmers who've come to town thinking, they'd like to settle here, and they're moving around because they can't find that stable housing. So for our mission, which has to do with our health, the health of our community, this intersection is clear. We can't build a stronger food system if we don't join the fight. And I really appreciated actually your words about the fight, the courage to fight. If we don't join the fight to allow different kinds of housing here that are suitable for people earning a little bit less money. Thank you.
Well, we're all very lucky to have you in the fight with us, Ellie, so thank you for that. Next panelist I'm going to hand the mic to, or I guess he's got the mic already, is Michael Galasso. And as I was standing here and folks were coming in, multiple people, did you hear Michael Galasso's on the panel? Did you hear Michael Galasso? So I think as again, someone here in Falmouth who for decades has been trying to move the necessary projects forward, Michael certainly has been on the front line in this housing battle. And I think, obviously with his perspective and the number of projects and the number of years, I think we're all going to learn something hearing from him.
Oh, thank you, Bob, and thank you, Ruth, for inviting me here and for putting this together for us today. So, as Bob mentioned, I did grow up here in Falmouth. We bought a house on Lakeview Avenue right in front of the Lawrence High School in a neighborhood of 10,000 square foot lots. It's a great neighborhood. When we pulled up in front of the house with the realtor, my father turned around to us. We were in the back seat. We were going around looking at houses. My father said, "Don't even bother to get out of the car. We are not buying a house in front of a school." So we've been there since 1961. It's a great neighborhood. And as I said, 10,000, 15,000 square foot lots. It's a neighborhood. But after graduating from Boston College, I decided with my girlfriend from North Falmouth, Robin Rowitz, to drive across country and go out to San Diego. And on my way there, we stopped in Pennsylvania and saw a good friend of mine, Chris Jinks, who grew up here in Falmouth and went to Cornell. And he was working in planning and traffic and transportation planning, which I had never heard of. And so when I did get out to San Diego, I looked at their graduate school at San Diego State, and they had an urban planning program. That was really the start for me in getting involved in real estate development. You know, a lot of institutions, Harvard, MIT, NYU, all have programs now for real estate development. Well, there weren't any back there. This was 1976. So I sort of put together the program and went to work. It was the first time growing up here in Falmouth or on the Cape. You know, during the summer, we all worked in restaurants, especially on the weekend. Well, I was able to get a job at the at the California Coastal Commission, which was in charge of planning all up and down the California coast. Anything from I-5 to the west had to get approval from the California Coastal Commission. And it was a job where I didn't have to work on weekends. So it was great, but I could only work for 9 months, and they required you because I wasn't a full-time employee there. But while I was there, I got to meet a number of developers, and one of them, a fellow by the name of Richard Williams, after I did one of my 9 month stints, asked me if I'd go to work for them and help them do nothing but try to get permits at the California Coastal Commission, which I helped them do. And he was the one who taught me how to be a developer. And this is before we had Excel spreadsheets. So we used to work off of accountants' papers. And if he came in and said, "You know what, school fees just went up, or the interest rate just went up," I'd take my eraser, redo the whole thing, add it back up and everything. So that's how I learned to do it. And a few years later, I met my business partner, Jim Barrow, and I've been in business with him for a little bit over almost 35, 40 years now. And during that time, we developed, redeveloped, renovated about 1,000 units of affordable housing. So it's a trait that I've always been involved in, is developing affordable housing. And it really started in the Little Italy neighborhood, where my brother, who's here tonight, has a little cafe that we've had for it since 1992. But in that neighborhood were some small lots, 50 by 100, 5,000 square feet. And downtown San Diego was just starting to be redeveloped. And what they realized was they were tearing down all the affordable housing, mostly single-room occupancy hotels. So the city of San Diego and their planning board came up with a plan that would allow us to build new single-room occupancy hotels without having to provide any parking. So we had a 50 by 100 lot, and we built 52 rooms on there. But it was in Little Italy, we had a lot of bakeries, restaurants, pizza pie. It was for those people and fishermen who needed affordable housing, and they just needed a little room. And that was sort of the start of us building affordable housing. We used numerous financial tools in order to do that. So as the years went on, my mom always lived here. I was in California to come back and forth. She loved to come out to California and go to the Hotel Del in Coronado. And unfortunately, she got ill, and I had just finished doing 3 projects in a row. And this was 2006. And I came back and actually bought a house almost right across the street from here on Spencer Baird Road. And didn't even know who Spencer Baird was. But without Spencer Baird, I don't think we would have had the fisheries or Hui or anything here. So bought a house there. And I said, okay, I'll take my knowledge that I've been doing and apply it here to my hometown. I still know people here, and maybe it'll be a little bit easier because building in California was very tough, and I figured I'd come to my hometown and apply that knowledge that I had to help them out. And as I was going through some clippings, my mother used to always clip out articles in the Enterprise, especially if my name was in there or something. And I'm going through these old articles, and there's one dated 1980. And I look at the back of it, and there's an article about the need for affordable housing in Falmouth, 1980. So we've had an issue for a very long time here in our community. So I came to Woods Hole. There was a little ad in the Enterprise looking for a project manager who would work with a nonprofit over in the Vineyard doing a housing rehab program over there. So I figured, hey, I live in Woods Hole, the ferry's right there, I get over the Vineyard, no problem. And so I went to work for a nonprofit called TRI, the Resorts Inc., as a project manager part-time over on the Vineyard. A lot of people said, well, you know, who needs affordable housing on the Vineyard? You know, you'd be surprised, and I was too. You go off the main roads on the Vineyard, you'd be surprised at the poverty there is on Martha's Vineyard. And we had people, mostly senior people, who couldn't afford to have their roof replaced, the windows replaced, or have heating and stuff, and that's what the program was. We gave people a grant of $35,000, helped them renovate their homes, so it was a great program. Then I helped them develop some income-producing property because they were a nonprofit, didn't have an ongoing source of income. Did some work in New Bedford and did some work in Brockton, and acquired a piece of property in North Falmouth that a gentleman owned. It was a little bit over 2 acres, and he had a plan to build some condominiums there, and they were going to be all 3 bedrooms, and all the bedrooms were upstairs. And it just wasn't a good plan, so I was able to acquire that piece of property and work through the ZBA with a plan that would have allowed for 12 units to be built on that property. But one person on the ZBA, and I still remember this so clearly, and once in a while I run into this gentleman, said that you have to reduce it down to just 5 buildings instead of 6, because buildings that are closer than 19 feet shouldn't be allowed. So our buildings were spaced apart of almost 20 feet. But he thought that that was too close, so we lost a building. We lost 2 units. Now, when we finally built the project, we had 10 units there, and it was all affordable. And HAC helped us very much on the lottery for that property. We got 100 applications. We did no marketing besides the lottery. 100 applications for 10 units. And of those 100 applications, 80 of them were all qualified to live at McGanser Crossing. That's the name of the property that's in North Falmouth that we built. So you can see just from that what the need is. And I know that Richard has one of his persons in his book, Janet Williams, single mom. We now have 9 single moms who live in McGanser Crossing with 22 kids. And thank you. But, you know, I just wish that people who make these decisions, who sit on the boards, would actually come out when we have our opening house and we invite all the people and meet the people. You couldn't have found a better group of people who are so excited to move into, you know, it's emotional, it really is, to move in and have something they can call home. We haven't had any people move out. They all pay their rent on time. They're great people. Ellie helped us build a garden out there for them. They've got 10 plots. They grow their own food. And recently, another developer from out of town asked me if he could use the plans that were used for McGanser Crossing because he admired it so much to build another project in town. So that was, you know, it was very successful. But the successful part is the human part of it. And I just wish that more people who make decisions on our projects will actually experience that, you know, and experience, because some of the people who moved in were folks that I knew their parents. Some of them was my coach in high school. And so, you know, there's a really big need for it. You know, I've been working, as some of you may know, on converting an old nursing home. That seems to be the thing these days. I don't know if we're not getting older, we don't need nursing homes anymore, but the one on Main Street called the Royal Nursing Home, and it's a fabulous building, and it was really built because we've done a lot of investigation of the history of the building. But it was built right after President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill and Medicaid became involved. And what was happening was we had a hospital here in Falmouth, but when people all of a sudden could get and stay at a hospital and not have to pay out of their pocket with Medicaid, the hospital became overwhelmed. There was only 100 beds. And at that time, nursing homes were just really a place where you'd go and retire and sit in a rocking chair. There wasn't a little medical help there. So that nursing home on Main Street was one of the first in the countries that was built specifically to take those patients and had nursing care as part of a nursing home. So we've been working for the last 2 years to get approvals with the help of many people, Hannah being one of them, and other people here from Woods Hole, appearing at a number of our ZBA meetings that we went through. And most of the issue regarding there was about parking. And we just got to get over this parking issue, especially for a property that's right on Main Street and has public services and stuff. But we had almost a year worth of meetings trying to solve a parking issue, which we eventually did. So coming out to those meetings and fighting back has really made a big difference, in this community. So I want to thank Ruth and Hannah and the other folks who've come to our meetings and everything, over the time. So that's what I'm working on now. It's a big project, a $17 million project. It'll be 67 units. And one thing that we're trying to do is that there's a big need for housing for our seasonal workers too. So this project will have a combination of yearly leases and seasonal 60 days minimum leases too, so we can help, house some of those folks too. So sorry to take so much time, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I think it's clear now to me, certainly, why everyone I spoke to was so excited that you were going to be part of this panel. And I think we're all very fortunate to have you, on the front lines, with Alisa and others, across the Cape and Islands. You truly are one of the warriors here in this fight. So thank you. So, first of all, I just want to again say what a great book Richard wrote. And like Alisa, when I was writing it, I felt like it was written for Cape Cod. You can see kind of all my tabs and notes in here. And you did such a wonderful job in not only delving into the history and explaining how economic discrimination replaced racial discrimination in the aftermath of the Affordable or the Fair Housing Act, but I think also categorizing. I think one of the sections I like most was when you went through and characterized, typical criticisms against or arguments, against housing, and those coming from the left and those coming from the right. And I was thinking about how can we, try to ground some of that in what the Cape faces. And of course, the obvious answer was go to social media and see what's out there. So literally, this morning, I went to social media, one of the typical pages, railing against housing, and not gonna give them a plug, but I did highlight some of the comments, and I wanted to maybe just read some of these to you and get your reaction on connecting the dots between comments from today's Facebook post and what you see nationally. So the post starts off, do you recall asking your elected representatives to change the zoning for your neighborhood? Do you want apartment complexes on your street? Do you think the town does a good job at enforcing the zoning we have now? Probably not. The crazy idea to change residential zoning in Barnstable to promote widespread development of apartment complexes was hatched by the Cape Cod Commission and is now being foisted upon us by business interests in Barnstable. They want apartment complexes everywhere. Please please make plans to attend the next meeting of the Local Comprehensive Plan Committee, September 12th at 5:30 in Town Hall. And in the meantime, here's what a few of our outspoken readers think about the plans we were shown. Complete insanity. These people are just idiots and morons. What should be happening is a complete moratorium on building, period. Back when we had open town meeting form of government, the voice of the people was heard loudly and clearly by our selectmen and all of the department heads. Our leaders and employees heard what their bosses, the citizens, wanted, and that's what they did. They knew that it wasn't their job to decide how our town should be. They knew their job was to implement the measures that would make the town the way the citizens wanted it to be. The planning department and growth management departments, and especially the Cape Cod Commission, believe it's their job to decide how our town and our villages should be redesigned and redeveloped into something entirely different from the way our citizens want them to be. They know better than we do about how the town should be run and what we need and want. They're enlightened beyond all of us, and it's that enlightenment mindset that is now bringing us almost 1,000 new dwellings into downtown Hyannis. Now that is apparently what brilliant planning looks like. I think the idea of a building moratorium is long past due. Be there or be bulldozed on September 12th in Barnstable Town Hall. So from today's Facebook post. So Richard, does this sound familiar?
Yes, so there are three classic moves there. One is to create a new bad guy. So in my view, the people who are excluding, who don't want those of different races, different classes to come into the community are the problem. And yet there's this shift so that the developer becomes the bad guy. And in most cases, you're talking about a developer who, yes, often wants to make a profit, but is trying to provide housing where people want it and where they need it. So I think it's it doesn't work. It doesn't work for me. The second thing is the specter of apartment complexes. Oftentimes there'll be an exaggeration. I often, people will talk about skyscrapers as if that would ever happen in a residential community. So there's the exaggeration. Oftentimes a reform might call for something more modest, and yet there's an assumption that there's going to be a large scale. The third is the term bulldoze. You see that a lot, and it seems scary. In Minneapolis, there was a meme that was used that the reformers who wanted to, they call themselves neighbors for more neighbors. They simply wanted to open up housing to more people. That they were involved in, they had the desire to bulldoze. And it turned out that the guy who popularized that, the NIMBY who popularized it, had, in fact, in his own home, bulldozed a small home that could have been a starter home for someone and built this McMansion. So you see these techniques all the time, but I think many of us can see through them.
And any techniques or any arguments that our panelists are hearing? What are you hearing things in town, Hannah, in opposition to some of the progressive movements to create housing, or Ellie, I'm sure Michael, you probably have some to add that you've been up against. But what else what have we missed? What wasn't in the Facebook post that's out there?
Well, Hannah's been to a lot of our ZBA meetings, so she can tell you what she's experienced there.
Yeah, that all rings very true. I'm actually from Minneapolis originally, and did grow up, was there, seen a lot of that opposition. A lot of signs in my neighborhood would have, zone for demolition, and that didn't really ring true to what was happening. But that's what really piqued my interest in this issue initially. And yeah, we do see a lot of environmental concerns come up here. So that's something I'm hoping you can give us some insight into. But I think, as somebody who is an ecologist, as my job, of course, care about the environment. But we see a lot of times people pose this issue, well, we can't have more development in this area because the wastewater system is already so polluted. We can't even think about bringing more people here. We can't think about denser development. So that's an issue that I see crop up a lot. That's very difficult to know how to respond to as somebody who wants to be conscious of the environment. So it'd be great to hear how you would speak to that.
Yeah, well, obviously the environment is something we all care about, and the specter that people raise is that if people pollute. And if individuals move here, it's going to, exacerbate an environmental problem. The assumption is that those people will simply disappear. They won't move anywhere. And as if the pollution won't be an issue in any case. The biggest, most of the environmental groups lined up in favor of reform because they recognize that people have to live somewhere, and that the worst thing you can do is push them out into further regions where they're going to add greenhouse gases because of the commutes. So the issue isn't whether or not human beings have an environmental impact. It's where can you minimize the environmental impact. And in fact, typically it's in an area where they're going to be close to their jobs and they're going to be having a more minimal impact on the environment. There are constraints on, there are impacts on schools, there are impacts on the environment, but those can be accommodated by local governments.
So Richard, if we could just build on that for a moment, one of the other areas that many Cape towns, including, here in Falmouth, have been focused on is climate policy and, trying to A, build for climate resilience, but also B, building for higher energy efficiency, striving for net zero energy, standards. But that obviously comes with added costs. When building to the highest levels of energy efficiency is not mainstream, and it's only the last couple windows at the end of the Pella catalog that hit those highest standards. So be interested to hear if you've seen any examples of where climate policy and housing policy have successfully moved forward, either at a local or at a state level, as a result of programs and supports to allow the two to be not in conflict, but harmonious.
Well, I would just say as a general matter, there, multifamily housing, which we haven't discussed the environmental impact of that per se. Multifamily housing is more efficient than detached single-family homes. When you share walls, the heating and cooling costs are reduced. So the carbon footprint of I hate to use the term denser housing because it's such a technical term that people their minds freeze at it. But you all understand this concept, and so I think that's the key, is not only that housing, that exclusionary zoning that forces people further out has an impact in that direction, but also that multifamily housing in general is more environmentally sound. I live in a detached single-family home. I'm not doing the best thing for the environment, and I don't want to be one of these people who is seen as a liberal scold who's telling people what kind of housing they should live in. That's not my point. My point is government shouldn't make it illegal to build the more environmentally sound type of housing.
No, thank you. Michael.
Yeah, can I add on to that? I think we have to stop using the excuse that it's going to cost more to do the right thing. I go to a lot of meetings where I see new projects being proposed, and they're no different than projects that we're building in the 60s and 70s and maybe even the 80s. The McGansett Crossing project is 100% electric. It's one of the first ones that was built. I know in Falmouth that was all electric. Not only that, but we added a car charging port in the garage. And when I was at the ZBA meeting and I brought that up, I remember a person in the board saying, electric car charging stations for poor people, they can't afford electric cars. Well, there's no forward thinking. There's got to be some forward thinking. I think we build our projects to last for years, not weeks. And there are so many incentives and so much money now available. It goes back to the C, cash. Yes, we need it and we shouldn't spend it foolishly, but we have to start thinking for the future when we build affordable housing. I always built affordable housing and felt that it needed to be better than market rate housing in the neighborhood because I know that people are going to oppose it. So all the material that we use in the way that we design it and use professional architects who know what they're doing and have done affordable housing needs to be better than what's in the neighborhood. Because if this is what we do for a living, which is what I do for a living, I would never get another project approved if it wasn't better. So I just think that as far as being able to make the buildings more climate friendly, energy efficient, we have to stop using the excuse it's going to cost more. Yeah, it does cost a little bit more. Don't be so lazy, go out there and find some more money in order to get it done and do it right. So I think that's what we have to do. And I think it will help us in our industry to be able to be more affordable housing that we can point to. Because McCancer Crossing was built in order for people to do that. I wanted people to point to it and say, not that that's where the poor people live or that's affordable housing, but isn't that a great addition to the neighborhood?
But Michael, I'm gonna borrow that line. Get out there and find some more money. I think it's right up there with mind your own damn business in terms of. Thank you, Richard. Another topic. Ellie was talking about kind of the young people and folks engaged in farming and the options for housing and going back to some comments that were made about 40B being an effective tool. We obviously have tools like the low-income housing tax credit that have helped to support the development of rental housing. So as a state, I'd say, rental housing, the development of rental housing is something that we are doing better probably than the creation of starter housing. But a recent statistic I saw, and we were discussing, before the start of this, was the Federal Reserve's, annual, or every 3 years, the survey, and looking at the net worth of families and average net worth of a family that got onto the ownership ladder and owned something being at $400,000, but the family that has only continued to rent being at $10,000. So kind of that 40x, delta between the two seems to underscore the importance of creating ownership opportunities like we did, after World War II with the Levitt towns and the programs that allowed. And in Massachusetts, we have a recently adopted program called Chapter 40Y that would incentivize cities and towns to develop higher density ownership for starter homes, capped on size. Can you offer some thoughts on your view, of the role of home ownership and creating that lower rung on the ownership ladder? I've heard rental kind of described as the hamster wheel that folks can get stuck on, and the leap from the hamster wheel to that ownership ladder only keeps on getting greater and greater. But what are some some insights or successful programs that you've seen that should be considered in places like Massachusetts?
Yes. Well, I know that, and I'm not being partisan here, that Kamala Harris has some new proposals for those who want to start to break their way into the ownership opportunities and the financial benefits that can come from that. I've been emphasizing the class aspect of all of these issues, but here I think it's really important to talk about the race aspect. Through redlining, America consciously robbed Black people of generational wealth. And because of that, exclusionary zoning laws impact all people of modest means. They particularly impact Black people. The black-white wealth gap remains gargantuan. So Black people make on average about 60% of what white people make. The median Black household wealth is more in line with 10% of median white wealth. Part of that goes all the way back to enslavement of Black people in America, but a huge part of it is what you're pointing to, Rob, which is the home ownership opportunities and the ability to accumulate wealth and then to pass it down to the next generation. And so, so I think opportunities to allow all individuals, but particularly Black people, to gain the opportunity for home ownership are crucial. And I didn't know about this Massachusetts opportunity, but that's one I want to look into more.
Thank you for that, and absolutely get you more info on 40Y. One of the other provisions in the Affordable Homes Act that was just secured, and this came up, I think 3 years ago here in Falmouth. Alisa Magnotta brought it to our then governor and lieutenant governor's attention that Cape Cod and other regions of the state that have high second home ownership have additional and different housing tensions. You have folks that are trying to get that first ownership opportunity, competing with a buyer who is looking to buy that same property as their second or third home, and it's an unfair competition, and so that additional tools are needed to be on the table here that aren't just in suburbs of Boston. So one of the things I think obviously everyone here in the audience has a perspective on the challenges and things that can and ought to be knocked down by these additional tools being put on the table. So I know we have some microphones ready to go out, and I'd like to open up, if we could, the audience Q&A with just asking folks for some of their observations that if we are putting tools on the table for the Cape and Islands and for places out in the Berkshires where you have a second home, third home market competing with working Cape Codders trying to get their first homes, what kind of barriers would you like to see get knocked down by those additional tools being put on the table? So maybe we open it up with that question if there's some comments, and then we'll take some additional questions from the audience. I guess we have one up here with Ellie to kick things off.
I just was thinking, as listening to this conversation about tiny homes. Talk about a barrier that needs to be knocked down. In our opinion, they suit a certain group in our working class perfectly, and they're environmentally friendly. And in terms of agriculture, it's the land that matters. The house could be really tiny. So that's something I'd like to see knocked down.
So, Richard, thoughts on tiny homes?
Oh, I think it's one of the most exciting movements. I mean, we now have a number of developers who are focused on tiny homes and bringing them to scale. And I think it's, we used to have in this country such a variety of housing, oftentimes right next to each other. And so, we didn't call them tiny homes, but we had tiny homes. Most homes were much smaller than they are today. And I think in these discussions, it's important to remind people because zoning reform can be scary to them. They think it's a brave new frontier and a brave new world. And in fact, in many cases, it's just reverting to what we had in this country for many, many years.
Just to finish that thought, from our experience, we were exploring the possibilities for another parcel we were looking at a couple of years ago. Anyhow, the question of tiny homes came up when we were in the building department, and we were told, I mean, it was almost, it was this kind of voice: there will be no tiny homes in Falmouth. Just, okay.
I have a question. Great. I understand in Martha's Vineyard, they're very concerned about every time there's a house for sale, Marriott or one of these B&B groups come in, flip it, and it becomes a bed and breakfast rather than a home for a family. And how do we in our town, I don't know if it's happening here in Falmouth, I would imagine it is. How do we in our town speak to that and look at regulations about how many of these corporations can come and just destroy our neighborhoods like that?
Right. So corporate investment and short-term rentals as another pressure here. So I think, Michael, you have something to add to that.
Yeah, just so you know that here in Falmouth, they have established a committee that is looking at some sort of regulations for Airbnbs, because as we know, they have taken up quite a bit of our inventory, especially for seasonal employees who try to come to work here. So I know that Falmouth is taking a look at it and recognizes that it's an issue. So there's probably more to come in the next few months.
And Richard, are you seeing this in other, other locations other than vacation destinations?
Yes, it's happening, and it's a number of folks are calling for regulation, and I have a different thought on this. I'm not opposed to the regulation, but I'm always looking for political allies to get more housing. And if big corporations are sucking up some of the existing housing, and if regulations are then going to stop them from doing so, and they want to purchase these properties, can they, you make all sorts of weird alliances in politics. Could they be a force? They've got political power. Could they be a force for pro-housing efforts so that there isn't this zero-sum game where any house that they take out of commission for an Airbnb or whatever it is would in fact be replaced by, if there were 10 new units, then we wouldn't be so concerned about what Marriott was doing. So could Marriott be a force for reform?
So I know one of the similarities that we draw between the short-term rentals here, similar to ski resort towns, and at one of the recent regional planning sessions, we were introduced to the concept of communities buying year-round deed restrictions, and in fact, Provincetown, I think just recently adopted and passed through home rule with support from the legislature, the ability to buy and place year-round deed restrictions on properties, that could go one way or another. So another question we have back here.
I actually was going to bring up the same thing, short-term rentals. And I'm just thinking, because you had talked about people buying into the community, because this is their second or third home. And I think there are people here, the house I stay in the summer, it's their family home, and the way they're able to keep it is they do rent it out for part of the season. So I think, and it's also what can enable new people to come, right? That they're using that rental money that they can afford to live here. So I was also thinking back to home in Canada and a ski resort that we spend time in, and a lot of the economy's based in rental. So I think there does need to be something done about short-term rentals. I'm an urban planner by trade. This is something we're really looking at. But like we said earlier, it's complicated. It's not just a simple solution. So I appreciate the comments you've already made. I don't know if you have any further in terms of the economics in communities.
Yeah, well, the issue comes up with respect to corporations that purchase homes and then rent them, not as a short-term rental, as you're suggesting, but just rent the homes, and whether that should be regulated as well. And my antenna go up on that issue. So part of the reason that communities don't like renters is renters need less income than someone purchasing a home. And so again, these are complicated issues, and so I see a downside to banning a corporation from purchasing a home and then having it rented out, full time, because is that a form of NIMBYism against those who, can't afford a home but can afford to rent? So that's why I came up with this convoluted idea of coming up with an alliance with Marriott, because I think fundamentally the issue is not enough housing, and rather than fight over how the existing housing is used, I'd rather find ways to develop unlikely allies or unlikely alliances that would build more housing, which is what we ultimately need.
We have another question back here with the microphone.
Thank you. So my question goes to the issue of the we're full mentality. And whoever has that bumper sticker on their car is obviously, letting the world know that's how they feel. In the housing development world, we know that that attitude is there. Maybe it's unspoken. And so we try to express to the community that if we don't do, more housing work, our workforce is suffering, our, ambulance response time is going to be greater, our lines are going to be longer, we're not going to have, supplies in our grocery store and workers in our restaurant. But it seems to me that we need to go further to try and explain or break down that absence of wanting change, the barrier that we don't want our community to change. So my question for Richard is, how do we address that lack of wanting change in the context of the exclusionary zoning? How do we try and promote exclusionary zoning and try to make it a priority for our elected officials and balance that against the absence of change attitude? Any thoughts to that? Because we do deal here in Falmouth with an elected town meeting, elected select board members, so they are, I think, prone to the we're full mentality. I think it's gone from NIMBYism to we're full, but maybe it's unspoken. So how do we try and address that as a community?
Well, this is a huge issue. This goes to the question of human nature, and we're resistant to change. We're nervous. We're full is just right in your face. It tells you exactly what they're thinking. So it seems to me that's an easier target to push back on in terms of, just to give you a concrete example, I hear that with respect to schools. We're full because the schools are already overcrowded and we can't make any more room. Neighborhoods turnover, so older people pass on, new families with young children move in, and the schools somehow make room for those children. We don't say to this family that owns, is able to purchase a single family home, we're sorry, the public school is full. We can't do anything about it. So I think we're full actually is helpful in making clear how kind of absurd that position can be. The bigger response is I think to go back to I'd say two things. One is to go back to the history in this country, and that there used to be much more variegated forms of housing, and that it's not scary because it's just revisiting the past. It's not something brand new that is going to be so disturbing to people. The other is to I know in Oregon, they showed pictures of what new housing would look like, and you probably have this issue all the time. Pictures are so people in Minneapolis and elsewhere, people were very scared about the idea that that you'd have a triplex in place of a single-family home. And then they started showing pictures of what it looks like, and it's much less threatening when you show that concrete example. Or a lot of these duplexes, you can't even tell it's not a single-family home. It just, you look closely and you see there are two doors. But I think that actual concrete examples of what change might look like that is not threatening can be helpful.
And I think that's a great point. I've heard it said many times that the villages that we would rank as the most attractive and the most desirable and where we want to work and walk and shop and live could not be built under today's zoning. I know my hometown, Somerville, Massachusetts, the mayor did a survey looking at what was built out, and 95% of the city could not have been built under the zoning that was in place at the time. So I think that's very impactful. Have another question here in the middle section.
So anybody who's read The Enterprise for a few months knows that the thing we talk about most in Falmouth is affordable housing and P. And in fact, nothing moves slower in this town than affordable housing and sewers. The lack of sewers is used as an excuse why we can't ever build affordable housing pretty much anywhere, even on sewers. Like, poor Mr. Galasso, you are a saint, sir. Yes, we have a nitrogen problem in the estuaries, right? And where does that nitrogen come from? It comes from our septic tanks. It doesn't come from the affordable housing that hasn't been built yet. But we have a tendency to always want to look for someone else to blame for it's the evil developer or whatever. Rather, how do we get people to look at, we are the enemy. We're part of the problem. We're the cause of it. It's our pee in the estuaries. And it's our responsibility, and we have the ability in a wealthy town like Falmouth. This is not a poor city. All the cities in the country, Boston, Baltimore, et cetera, have had to spend billions to clean up their water, their coastal waters. We can easily build sewers. They're not high technology. They're not something new, but we don't build sewers, I suspect, because then we'd have to build affordable housing. How do we get people to see that in one way or another, we are the problem, not the affordable housing?
Well, I think you answered the question quite effectively. It's an excuse that's thrown up there. There was a case in Texas where there was found to be a fair housing violation because there was this very wealthy community, Sunnyvale, that said the reason they couldn't have any affordable housing was the sewage issue. It's just nothing can be done, and the court saw right through that, and they did ultimately build affordable housing, and that's part of why I'm so keen on this idea of an economic fair housing act. It could be a state level act that puts the burden on the community that's throwing up some smokescreen to say, we can't possibly have more housing or more affordable housing because of X, Y, and Z. And then they'd have to prove it. And I think in many cases they wouldn't be able to. But you deal with this all the time. I shouldn't be.
Well, luckily the nursing home is on the sewer system. So which is a good thing. And we'll actually use less than what the nursing home did. So when we found that out, I asked, well, then can we take what we're not using and give it to another affordable housing project? They said, oh, no, it doesn't work that way.
Never does.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank everyone. And we're going to close this out with kind of a speed round going down to Richard at the end. And I just want to say that I'm leaving today incredibly hopeful. Because it did feel like you wrote this book about Cape Cod, but you also wrote this book highlighting successes and highlighting strategies that have worked. And that gives me hope, knowing that we have organizations like Housing Assistance Corporation. We have stakeholders like the folks that are here in this auditorium. So armed with both the knowledge and armed with the tools that we can make a difference. So that's my closing comments in the speed round, and I'll hand it to Hannah.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming and for everybody who came and participated today. And I think it's just powerful to be in a room of people who care about this. And the biggest message that I'll leave is it's just important that we show up. If you're, I firmly believe that we might be the silent majority with these issues, and we're powerful when we're in a room together trying to come to solutions. Oh.
Ellie, to you.
Okay. So I echo the being grateful for all the positive examples that you showed and ways that that the resistance has been overcome in so many places. I always feel when I'm inspired in a situation like this, like, what's next? Okay, who wants to get together and talk about what do we need to do next? And I hope that I feel like there are many different entities in this town thinking about affordable housing, and I really hope that they begin to come together and coordinate an approach.
Michael.
Yeah, again, want to thank Ruth and also, Richard too. Bob, thanks for, great committee and everything that you put together here. One other thing too I want to thank is the enterprise. You brought up the enterprise. They've done a great job bringing this issue to the forefront. They did a whole series on people who really need affordable housing and opening up people to it. So, the enterprise would be thanked for doing that. And, you do need to come out to the meetings. If you see an affordable housing project that you support, a good affordable housing project that you support in the community, you need to come out, because oftentimes we're there alone with our attorneys, fighting the battle and stuff, and they get tired of hearing from us. So we really do need your support. You can make a difference. So thank you for coming this afternoon, and appreciate your support here. And I've appreciated all the support, Hannah and everyone else who've supported the projects that I've done. It makes a difference, so thank you.
And Michael, sometimes they threaten to physically remove the attorneys. So
I've heard that. That's a new thing.
Bring a few dollars for bail money.
Yes,
if
I've
you could.
heard that.
So Richard, thank you again, and I would love to hear that your parting thoughts and hopefully words of encouragement. You're the reason we're here, and I'm privileged to close it out with you.
Well, thank you so much, and I feel privileged to be here. I mean, this is an engaged and energetic audience that wants to try to make a change, and I think there's two common denominators to the places that have seen reform. One is people like you who are committed to the issue and form alliances across ideological lines sometimes, but even within, on the liberal side, with various different groups that don't necessarily work with one another. So I think they're the makings of change in that. And the other through line of reform is that the situation has just gotten so bad that something has to happen. And it sounds to me like that's what's happening here, that the affordability issues have become such a crisis, and the opportunity issues have become so severe that that there really isn't any option but to begin to take action. And hopefully, this forum can be a piece of the larger puzzle to get people motivated.
Well, again, on behalf of Housing Assistance Corporation, I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank Ruth for being so instrumental in making this happen. Thank all of you for attending. And if you don't have your copy of Excluded yet, and you can see how many tabs I put in, copies will be available, and Richard will be signing copies. I'll be at the end of the line, but Thank you very much. Thank all of you for coming.